Welcome to episode 7 of the Students of Real Estate podcast. Today we are joined by Robert Muollo, a senior relationship manager at Mass Housing. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course, Lorenzo. Thank you for having me.
So, just for those who don't know, I'm Lorenzo. I'm a junior actually, and the VP at the real estate group. So, Robert, we'll just start off by asking you, can you kind of tell us about yourself? How'd you grow up, and where'd you grow up, and what led you to Clark University?
Yeah, so I grew up right outside of Boston in Quincy, Massachusetts, and was led to Clark by not a straight path for sure. I actually attended junior college prior to Clark, and then got accepted into Clark University. Originally as a biology major, and it was only once I got to the college where I realized they had a geography and urban studies program, and that's always been of interest to me, and I actually switched majors junior year into geography, which was more than maps. It was really about the kind of the urban landscape and all of the different things that happen in the nation, in the world, cities around, and just all the complexities therein. And it just was totally something that I was curious about and interested in. So just growing up, near Boston, being, in and around cities all the time, I've always had an interest in that. And that eventually led me to Clark after, originally interested in science and biology. So not a straight path to get to where I ended up, but it was a great process.
Got it. So you spent your 4 years there in Clark, studying geography, right? And then you did your master's right after, right? So how come you did master's right after and not kind of graduate or get a job like most people do?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough. Clark University has a fifth-year master's program.
Okay.
So I ended up taking a lot of my master's classwork while I was still a senior. And I pursued a master's in community development and planning at Clark University. And it really kind of was a kind of focused a more narrowed path, which I was interested in from the field of geography, which was quite broad, everything from environmental science to the cities and to the urban landscape, and that's what I really enjoyed. And the community and development master's program at Clark really did hyper focus on that work. So I continued to get my master's in that field. And that's really where I was introduced to housing and community development finance, which was something we would gloss over and talk about in undergrad, but it really started in the master's program where we actually dug into Excel spreadsheets and actually talked about how plans and planning actually gets done at a practical level with the funding available, and really introducing those concepts of real estate that are fundamental concepts, and then layering in the added component of oftentimes income restricted affordable housing, which is what I focus on currently.
Right. I feel like it's very interesting that, most people stumble into real estate on the investments, mindset, doing investments. But you, growing up since you were little, you were interested in the other side, more being on the city side and on the planning side. So what do you think kind of, sparked that interest in being in that side of the business?
Yeah, it's a good question because I've considered myself a generalist, and I'm just curious about learning and understanding many different things of how the world works around us. And that's one part of it. And real estate, it's fundamentally someone's home. It's also many other things. It's an asset. It's a liability in some circumstances. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's land. It's finite. And the approach that I took from it was, well, it's fundamental to health and safety, and having a family. Everyone needs and has or should have a home and a roof over their head. So it was more of a understanding of like, this is important, but also all of the things in the world that impact housing and real estate, from economics, sociology, history, geography, the built environment, location. There's a lot of different components and disciplines that kind of get involved when you start talking about real estate. And to your point, stumbling into it is fair, because there are so many qualities and so many components to what real estate actually is, and what it might mean to someone might mean something different to another person. And I think that's where I came into it. And then, secondly, more personally, from a standpoint of people needing homes and that being the foundation, is growing up, I did have a personal experience where our family did need some assistance in affording where we lived. So I have very deep personal respect for providing housing for people. And it wasn't really until I went to college and started talking about finance where it was very interesting to me to like, oh, this is actually how you can do that. How you can produce housing that's affordable, how you can save housing that is affordable, and rehab housing, and make housing where it's part of the community. So it was kind of a blend of many personal and professional aspirations that I had that kind of led me to what I do today and what I've done for my career.
Awesome. Sounds good. And before we're obviously going to talk more about that, but I want to still talk about, your college career. So how would you describe yourself as a student? Were you more like career oriented, or were you more of figuring things out as you go?
Definitely the latter. I had the curiosity, but it was still quite nebulous to me. In college, or at least in my experience, there was a lot of theory. How are cities planned? How do they operate? What are the social constructs? And it was very theoretical. And having the community development and planning and community development program, we actually got to look at things and be more practical and ask the question, well, that's a great plan, but how does it actually get done? And I was fortunate enough to have a really, in my mind, influential professor that was totally looked up to and totally was able to just make that connection from planning to practice. And the professor was a practitioner himself. So he actually knew how to get things done, and he shared his experiences in doing so. And one example I can provide is we actually went up to an old mill building in New Hampshire, and the building was completely dilapidated and not used. It was abandoned. And the task was, okay, put together a pro forma and find financing sources to rehabilitate this mill building into its highest and best use. What can we do with this? So we spent a good amount of time talking to the building owner and talking to people in the neighborhood and researching available financing, and put together a financing plan and a business plan to actually get get this building, which was beautiful. It was just old and just wasn't cared for any longer, back into good use. So, that I didn't think about my career or where I wanted to go with my career at that point. It just was something that totally interested me. And as I worked through that, I'm like, wow, there's actually jobs that entail this. So I can kind of fit my job to something that interests me. And that's the stuff that did.
Got it. No, sounds good. I mean, I like to ask that question because I feel like, a lot of students feel, a little bit nervous because they might be on their third year or their second year or even fourth year and they're not sure what they want to do. But it's more of, different things happen in your life and you kind of go with whatever opportunity comes. And I mean, I'm someone that, experiences that. So I really like to ask that question. And so, obviously you spent, so 5 years in total in Clark. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. And then you started your career in Worcester at the Neighborhood Improvement Corporation. So kind of just tell us about that. How did that role come about and what was that experience like?
Yeah, that was essentially an internship, and it just totally happened organically through networking. And the organization was a small community development corporation, and they had just built their first home ownership project, so affordable home ownership in Southwest Worcester. So I was still at Clark during this time, and effectively was an internship for me, but I was able to help the project manager market and sell these affordable homeownership opportunities that they just built. So that was really like the first experience I had in a business. As a community development corporation, they had spent a lot of time, money, and effort to build the units, and it was our job to market and sell them. So it was short. It was a stint, but it was great because I was able to, again, just like get hands-on experience while I was still at school, talking about scenarios and concepts and theories. But this was the actual work, and so that was quite a good first experience.
Yeah. Oh, you're totally right. I definitely said that wrong. It's internship, and then your second one was at Neighborhood Works America. So you were a foreclosure prevention intern. What was that until?
Yeah. So that was around 2008 when the housing market took a huge hit. It was a huge economic crisis, and partially the reason for that, or a big part of the reason for that, is a lot of homeowners were upside down on their mortgages. A lot of homeowners had mortgage interest rates that were adjustable, and when those interest rates adjusted, they went 100 basis points higher. They went from 5% to 15%. And the magnitude was so great that a lot of people ended up either losing their homes to foreclosure or about to lose their home in foreclosure. So what we did was try to prevent foreclosure. And it was just a total eye-opener, just from like a personal standpoint. You had families coming in that were going to lose their house unless we could try to help. And that was, quite difficult to be a part of because the stakes were so high. And the organization's role was to counsel the homeowner and work with the bank to work out a solution so that they could save their house fundamentally at the end of the day. And there were successes, and those successes were awesome, just like on a professional level, but also on a personal level. And then there were times that we just couldn't help. So my role, which was a very small role, was just reporting on our successes and the volume of people that were coming through our doors. And the volume was quite high. It was just incredible how many people were impacted from all different backgrounds, from all different socioeconomic classes. It just really impacted a lot of people, and it was eye-opening, but it was also, looking back on it, a good experience for me to understand how like policies and decisions matter, and the impacts that they can have on people that are part of those, ultimately part of those decisions.
Right. Okay. Got it. Well, I mean, I imagine that was a very like learning experience, huge. So okay, so now that was your second internship. Now you finish Clark 2009, and now you go into the city of Newton as a housing development planner. So how come did you end up in you grew up in Quincy, you went to Clark? How'd you end up in Newton working there?
Yeah, again, totally networking. I spoke to my professor. I was worried about getting a job. It was during that economic recession, 2008, 2009. I was like, I need to get a job. I have student loans. I need to enter the workforce. And I actually got the job before I finished my master's paper. I put the job over completing my last requirement for my master's because that's how nervous I was. And it was really a conversation with my professor who put me in touch with essentially the hiring manager at the city. And it didn't give me a leg up. I still needed to interview. It was my first job interview out of college, or still in college, for a full-time position. But it really was born out of two things. One, just the urgency to get a job, and then two, the position looked really appealing because it involved working with building and preserving affordable housing in the community. So that's what drew me to the job itself. It was just having the opportunity to continue all the stuff that I had learned in school. So it definitely fit with where I knew I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. But that's where that started, and it was a great experience.
Got it. So can you expand a little bit more on, what were your daily responsibilities like, and what was that kind of, like, what were you doing more specifically?
Specifically, I was part of an office that managed federal funds to build or rehabilitate affordable housing within the city. So we had these dollars that we would lend to developers to do just that. And the simplest way I can kind of frame it is this is low cost loans or straight grants that come with a set of strings attached. Meaning, if we provide these dollars, you have to agree to rent the new building out at an affordable price for X number of years. And that's an oversimplification. There are a lot of rules and regulations that come with it, and it was our job to manage those expectations as well as actually produce and put the money to work.
Got it. Okay, so you were more on the financing side. I thought it was more of reviewing the development projects that were being submitted by developers. Did you have any enrollment in that?
We did have some role. You're right, it was mostly on the feasibility of the project from a financing and overall development plan perspective. But we also had, the city had planning staff, land use planning staff that would review the zoning requirements as well. So it was a lot of coordination amongst other departments within the local government, from planning, inspectional services, the finance department, there are just a lot of different components into actually approving a new construction in a city or town.
Got it. Okay, so you spent 6 years in Newton, and then you transferred over to Quincy. So just kind of talk about that transition and how did that come about, and what were you doing in Quincy?
Yeah, I was fortunate to do a lot of the same work in Quincy that I did in Newton, and I was really fortunate to go back to my hometown to do that work. And the role was a bit expanded. I was able to manage not only one HUD program, but a few. And it was just, an expansion of responsibility. But it was also really, really cool to be able to come home, essentially, and see and be part of the change in the city. Just having that insight as to what the city was growing up, and looking at a 150 unit affordable housing development that's going to change for the better, in my opinion, a certain neighborhood in a city that I grew up in and remember being completely different, was really neat. So it was a good experience with a lot of great people, and a lot of great momentum to improve the neighborhoods in the city I grew up.
Yeah, no, I imagine. I mean, how does that feel being, involved, directly with that role of, affordable housing development? I imagine that's, feels satisfying, right? Personally, as you say. So, you spent 2 years there, and then you transferred over to Mass, working for the state. You spent 5 years there. So kind of just also talk about that transition and what were you doing there more specifically?
Yeah. Again, like always wanting to continue to grow and learn. And I completely stepped outside of my comfort zone for this position. It was an area that I just wasn't part of before, and the role specifically was in the public housing division of the state's Department of Housing and Community Development. So I had no experience with public housing. I had only experience managing these grant programs and these funding programs from HUD, and it was completely stepping outside of my comfort zone. But it interested me because a big part of the position was working on the redevelopment of state-aided public housing. And it really wasn't until I got there that I realized that there's all this housing stock that is state-aided, in addition to federally aided public housing, that is just in dire need of work. And just being under-resourced for a long time. Everyone that I encountered worked super hard, were super smart, and were totally dedicated to making sure that the housing is decent, safe, and sanitary. Meaning it was no one's fault. It's just that over time, resources couldn't catch up with the demands of keeping this housing rehabilitated. And part of what I was tasked to do was to help redevelop these properties. And just for a matter of scale, in Massachusetts, there are 43,000 units of state-aided public housing that are funded through the state budget, not through the federal budget. And that's 43,000 units of deeply affordable housing for families, for people with disabilities, for seniors. And it's just really an important resource for every person in the Commonwealth that it's there. So my job, and not so many more words, was to help find resources to fix buildings up and to make sure that they continue to be habitable. A lot of these buildings were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were ending their useful life. And one of the novel approaches to finding capital to help was actually partnering with the private sector to find some private capital to leverage public dollars to complete a capital stack so we could actually work on these projects and get them done.
Got it. So now this role was more involved in. So you were more involved in the construction and renovation part of it, correct?
It was redevelopment just at a bigger scale. So at the municipal level, there were a lot of smaller scale, like 5, 10, 15, 20 unit developments. There were a few bigger ones, ranging in 100, 150. A lot of these state-aided public housing developments are, 100 plus units. And redevelopment was not just rehab, but actually demolition and new construction.
Oh, okay.
So it's demolishing the existing stock, relocating the households that already live there, demolishing the units, and then rebuilding and replacing one for one those public housing units, plus adding additional mixed income units, or could be at a different area median income range or market rate units, and then bringing back the residents to their new homes. So it's a years-long process that certainly we, the state, did not develop the buildings. The development community does, but our role was to make sure that the plans were feasible, that the feasible both from a development standpoint and a financial standpoint, and that we could actually get these projects done.
Got it. Okay, so just moving on a little bit, you spent 5 years there, and then you quickly were working with Somerville, the housing authority, and then you transferred over to your current role at Mass Housing. So just quickly go through that again, another transition and your roles, and then we'll dive deep into the Mass Housing role.
Yeah, just quickly. Again, I was able to learn a lot at the Housing Authority, just the day-to-day management, property management aspect, as well as asset management of public housing. And again, great experience with a lot of hardworking folks. And it was really awesome to be able to engage with the residents and do my best to make sure that the residents had decent homes, and that they are in the community, and making sure that we did our best to keep the housing stock as best we could, because again, a lot of the buildings tend to be older or outdated, and being responsive to maintenance requests, to recertifications and paperwork that needs to happen, and how we can just kind of be as seamless as we can, so that residents don't have to feel burdened by any of those additional layers that the state and or federal government can require. So it was a really great experience with awesome colleagues. But yes, then I did accept a position at Mass Housing, and that's where I am currently.
Yeah. So just for those who don't know, I think that a lot of people are very interested in learning about the affordable aspect of development. I did a presentation in the Real Estate Club a couple of weeks back on development, and I had a couple questions on, how these affordable projects are planned and done, and financed specifically. So just talk about, what is Mass Housing for those who don't know, and also what is your role there as we speak.
Sure. So Mass Housing is a housing finance agency, and housing finance agencies were created through legislature, and the agencies have authority to essentially issue bonds and make mortgages, lend funding for the creation of income restricted housing. So there are a lot of different facilities and ways in which that's done, but the primary way is issuing tax exempt bonds from the private marketplace, and those bond proceeds then go into a deal to fund both construction and permanent financing to create or preserve income restricted units across the Commonwealth. So Mass Housing is one of many housing finance agencies across the country. Like, for example, there's an Idaho finance agency and a Minnesota housing finance agency, et cetera. So we're a quasi-public entity where that's our mission, is to, again, produce those affordable units across the Commonwealth.
Got it. And what do you specifically do in Mass Housing?
So specifically, I work in multifamily programs on the business development side. So one main component of my job is to originate loans to developers, to sponsors who want to produce or preserve affordable housing in the Commonwealth. So I engage with the sponsor up front as part of originating the loan, and I am the sponsor's point of contact throughout the loan process, from origination through commitment of the actual financing. So that's, generally speaking, what I do. And quickly, what that means is I'm looking at development budgets, all the due diligence up front, and structuring the funding structure for each deal, and having a lot of conversations with the developer to better understand their assumptions and their plan for the actual financing, so that we can have the loan underwritten and then ultimately committed by the agency board.
Got it. And can you also expand on what is that process like if somebody wants to develop affordable housing in Boston or Mass overall? What does that process entail, and what are basic information that people need to know before jumping in? Because I imagine it's very competitive, right? I imagine obviously affordable housing is a huge need in the country, and I imagine that a lot of people are interested in developing, but it's what I know is very competitive. And obviously the money is limited, and it's not going to be given to everybody. So yeah, just go on and talk about that.
Yeah, it's definitely its own topic to fill quite amount of time on. But if I could summarize, it would be a lot of the affordable housing has the same fundamentals as any commercial real estate, multifamily real estate. On top of those fundamentals, and in lieu of traditional debt and equity, it's just really where to start is understanding the funding sources that are available for the production of affordable housing. And the main source available across the country is the low-income housing tax credit, in which investors purchase a tax credit, and in return, the entity selling the credit, typically the sponsor, is receiving equity for the purchase of that tax credit. So that's a major source that kind of underpins capital stacks of deeply affordable housing construction here and across the country. And oftentimes paired with a tax credit, equity is debt, right? You still require debt to build. And there are really two kind of main facilities for that. or execution types, one of which is taxable debt and the other is tax-exempt bond debt. And tax-exempt bond debt does pair well with one of the low-income housing tax credit equity programs called the 4% credit.
Right.
So what we see and what we're looking at typically, though there are other facilities, is really the 4% credit with the tax-exempt bond paired together to form most of the capital stack to develop. And then there's any number of state and local subsidy programs that have the same goal of producing the income-restricted units. So, where to start is I would actually start with the low-income housing tax credit program. And there are many different actors across the Commonwealth. The state is a great resource to understand the funding sources available, but that would be the 101, is look at not only commercial real estate debt and equity, but really look at those two components that are specifically geared to affordable housing, and the LIHTC program is a big component of that.
Got it. So yeah, I have a bunch of questions, and like you said, it's a whole another episode. But yeah, we'll talk briefly about it. So can you? Oh my God, I'm blanking out. I have my question ready. I have another follow-up question after that, but I really wanted to ask this. I just remember. So is the capital stack on these projects typically provided, like debt and equity, are they both provided by these agencies? Or because I was thinking, I don't have any experience in this, but I was thinking that the debt was, a private, a bank or whatever, and then the equity was provided by the LIHTC or any other subsidies. So is it are both or basically the total capital stack provided by the state?
It's a good question. So on the tax credit side, the state, in every state, obtains from the federal government what's called a volume cap. So each state is allocated a total capacity of the dollar of credits that they could issue for each year. And I apologize, not credits, but actual bonds that they can issue for each year. And the state will allocate the volume cap, and the bank, in this case Mass Housing, will issue bonds that an investor will purchase. Those bond proceeds then go into the deal as debt. And on the equity side, the developer will syndicate the low-income housing tax credit through investors. So the investor who purchased the credit, the investor will purchase the credit. The equity from that credit purchase then goes into the deal as equity.
Got it.
So the state plays a pivotal role in the volume cap piece, as well as the soft debt or the other subsidy programs. But typically the bank is, in this case the Housing Finance Agency, is issuing the bonds, and then an investor or another bank, it could be, purchases those bonds, and those come into the deal as debt, whereas the credit equity comes in as equity through an investor. So together, that's kind of how you complete the capital stack. And I mentioned a couple of different players there in terms of how that actually gets done.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds good. And also, so obviously, can you, on the LIHTC side, there's the 4%, and then there's the 9%. So I feel like one is competitive, one is not competitive. Again, I know very broad information on this. So yeah, if you can expand on that, and yeah.
Yeah, so you're correct. The 4% is a competitive credit, and the reason it's competitive is that the 4% credit pairs with a tax-exempt bond financing, and that financing offers a competitive interest rate because the proceeds are tax-exempt. So it essentially becomes lower cost capital. So by accessing the 4% credit, you're also able to access lower cost capital through a tax-exempt bond. Both types of credits have different requirements. Again, totally for a different or an expanded time to kind of fully get into the history around, but it's a really interesting program to read about and learn about because it really does combine kind of the public sector and the private sector and public capital and private capital on the whole. I mean, you're at the end of the day building affordable housing for the public good, and a private investor is making contributions toward that. So it's a really complex but great program that is super competitive, especially in high cost areas like Massachusetts.
Right. And, my follow-up question is, you mentioned that there is obviously a cap of the amount of money that the city can give. And so how does the city, I imagine, let's say, well, you can tell me, I don't know how many developers submit projects for affordable, and, how does the city choose these developers or these projects, and, what is that process like, and what makes a developer stand out?
Yeah, that's so. I do want to clarify a city doesn't choose projects for that resource. The answer to your question on what makes a project stand out is every state has what's called a qualified allocation plan, and that's something that the tax credit program requires. So if you were to Google Massachusetts Qualified Allocation Plan, that is essentially the guidance that the state provides to say, here are the projects that will be competitive for this resource. And it's a couple dozen pages long, but it really lists off all of the different components based on need, meaning, what kind of housing is needed across the Commonwealth and across all states in the country. Is it very low-income housing? Is it moderate-income housing? Is it, there are any number of different components that are part of that. But that's the best resource for understanding, where the competition is, and what the expectation is for the kinds of housing development that should be built.
Got it. And obviously, I want to see if you can give us like a super broad outline of, let's say I'm a developer and I have a lot and I want to develop affordable housing. How is that process like, just super broad, quickly, they got to develop the plans and then submit, and what do they need to submit to the city? Yeah, just kind of how that works.
Yeah, it is it's just like any real estate development. Affordable housing is no different in the sense that you're prospecting and looking for a site and looking at crunching the numbers just to get a better understanding of the economics, working within the locality for zoning, permitting, entitlements, and a financing plan, and then going to the bank for financing. And then obviously the construction, lease up, marketing and lease up, and then conversion into permanent financing. And a lot of the timeline can be very different based on the type of product being produced. Excuse me, as you mentioned earlier, the affordable housing resources, there's such a demand on that it can take a couple of years to get that financing. But also there could be some local concerns or issues that need to be solved locally, whether that be zoning, environmental, historic. There are any number of factors that could contribute to the timing and the level of diligence that's needed to resolve before you can proceed as a developer. So again, it doesn't really, creation of affordable housing still has the same fundamentals as commercial real estate, but then you do have the added layer of these other capital finance tools available that, especially in Massachusetts, but also in other high-cost areas, there's such a demand for. So it can elongate the timeline.
Got it. Yeah, so it's the same process, just the main difference is the financing side of it. And you quickly mentioned that it might take years. So how does like a developer, they plan, they already spend all this money on pre-development and plans and submitting, for the building permit, whatever. How does a developer deal with that if it takes years to? Oh, actually, before you answer that, is the process for the financing a yearly thing, or how is that money deployed?
It is a yearly deployment. I'll use your word for that particular resource. It's really interesting. Across the state, there's federal subsidy, there's local subsidy, there's state subsidy that also support these capital stacks. Some communities or some administrators of the funds offer rolling application. Others issue point-in-time requests for proposals. It really does vary depending on the community even. So, to your point, or maybe to your question is, as a developer, you've done your pre-development, and then now what? A big component of the qualified allocation plan and other plans or requests for proposals would be readiness to proceed. So having a concept is one thing, but having your permits and pricing in place, that's different, right? That's readiness to proceed, and you'll see in many documents for funding or subsidy that readiness to proceed is always a qualifier. Because the demand is there, funders want to see a project that's ready to proceed and not, partially or still going through early stages of pre-development work.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's interesting because I feel like, obviously numbers are going to be different if you're building affordable. Obviously, rents are going to be much lower. So your typical financing might not work, with higher interest rates. I imagine, the bonds are lower interest rates and that financing. So, how, I don't know. I'm just curious. So, they want the developer to already have the building plans and permits already approved. But what if the city doesn't decide to give them the money? And now the project doesn't work. Is that part of the risk, or how does that work?
It's certainly part of the risk, and I think, perhaps no different again from commercial real estate development. There's always the risk involved. I think, every step along the pre-development process that you're able to button up mitigates that risk and presents a better case to funding, because if you already have permits, if you already have city approvals or municipal approvals, If you already have your obviously your development team in place, you have your pricing, all of those coincide with readiness to proceed. So certainly, yes, there's absolutely risk involved, particularly if you're a developer needing to secure other soft resources or local resources. There is a lot of that. To make these deals financially feasible and to pencil out, you do need those subsidies. And this is why also it can take months, years really, to go from pre-development to shovels in the ground, because you're arranging a capital stack that it has so many different sources in it. It's not just debt and equity. It's tax-exempt bond debt, it's low-income housing tax credit equity, and it's any number of soft debt resources. And that's just one example. There are many different examples within the industry as to how to put together a capital stack. But that does require a lot of lead time.
Got it. Yeah. I completely lost track of time. So I just have a couple more questions, if that's fine. Maybe 10 more minutes. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for everything, and I want to go back to you and talk about your career. What do you think was your toughest challenge you faced overall in your career?
Toughest challenge, I think. I think it was during COVID. The whole world was changed, and because of my work in housing, obviously just like the foreclosure crisis impacted homeowners in a disproportionate way, COVID impacted renters in a very focused way, if that's the right word. But we needed to do something about that because people were laid off from their jobs and couldn't afford their rent. And that was a real challenge, but there was any number of programs in the Commonwealth that did its best and was super effective in a short amount of time to help renters from losing their homes because of a job loss, through a no-fault reason. They were at risk of being evicted and were falling behind in their rent. So it was a challenge, but also really it was an accomplishment in the sense that we were able to do something about that through a number of different programs that all had to be stood up very quickly and required a lot of close coordination and collaboration across a variety of sectors that may not even have talked to one another in the past. Now we have a global pandemic, and it was really the right thing, and I'm glad it happened, that people work together to figure out how to stem the tide a little bit from some of these, for helping renters that were in arrears, again, through no fault of their own. So it was a big challenge, and I personally learned a lot about myself and, in a career about how to just have bold ideas, talk to people, expect to fail, it's okay, you can kind of figure it out, and having the energy and the urgency to do that kind of really came out of that process. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I have two more questions. Just kind of I feel like a lot of students are very interested in this affordable part of development. So how do you think students that are in college right now that might be interested in joining, doing something similar that you do, how can they set themselves up, kind of for success, and what can they do to get a role in that space, basically?
Yeah, I think, continue to follow your interests first and foremost. Ask questions, be curious, learn about the kind of the history and the policy. Financing always, is where the rubber meets the road. And you have a great school and opportunity to learn and sharpen those skills and hone those skills, and that's super important. But there's a whole world where you can continue to, do something like that is of interest on maybe it's more finance oriented, but also work on kind of promoting the public good and providing housing opportunities for as many people as we can. And I don't think there's a single answer that I or anyone might be able to give, but I think just reading and learning more about the space, and that it's just as challenging as typical maybe commercial real estate and investments. It just has a whole nother different layer on it too, in terms of all the things we talked about with like how things are structured, the policy impacts, and continuing to just broaden that understanding of the space and curiosity of the space is a great start, because that's more or less how I ended up in a career in this space.
Got it. What's next for you? Where do you see yourself in, let's say 5 to 10 years, like long term? What do you aspire to do? Do you want to keep in that space, or maybe do something else?
Well, 5-10 years, Lorenzo, I'm going to interview you in 5 and 10 years, and you can tell me all about where you've come, because it's tough to tell. I think, but it's a good question, and it's really just continuing to do the work. And as you know, like the markets change all the time, and you have to be adaptable and pivot and have good ideas or new ideas, and I think that's always going to be a good challenge to have. And 5-10 years from now, hopefully projects that are conceptual now are built, and I can look at new things to really affect the same mission, the same goal.
Awesome. So just lastly, how can students connect with you if they want to, reach out to you and learn more about what you do?
Yeah, I'd be happy to send along my email address, and happy to chat with anyone interested in anything that we talked about. It's a passion of mine, but they can certainly reach out. Lorenzo, I know you have my contact info, so. Yeah.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, Robert, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, Lorenzo. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Definitely. All right.